you all very much for being here and for returning with us. We are very, very thrilled that you're here tonight. As a matter of fact, when we started off, it was the first edition? Yeah, the first edition. We had a film, I can't remember the Cool Rush, and you won an award for that film. It was a very interesting film. Different subject this time. So you're returning with this film. It will be Chaos. And maybe just quickly introduce yourself and your producer, and then I'll ask the first question.
So I'm Lorena Luciano, Sara Bergamaschi, associate producer at Filippo Piscopo, who happens to be co-director and husband. So my husband, so it's a partner in film and life. And thank you to the SR Socially for the festival for having us back with another festival in competition, which is a great honor. Mm-hmm. And very quickly, this film has started many years ago. We were actually still finishing the film in question. And we have lived in the United States for 20 years now. And ironically, when the first big flux of migration, this was after the Arab Spring started, we were working on another work for hire on the border with Arizona and Mexico. And it was, of course, extremely, it was shocking all of a sudden to live in the United States and, to be working on a migration documentary in the US and see from afar the crisis, what it was called back then, crisis of the posthumous Arab Spring, all these migrants arriving in Lampedusa. And I always say this phrase that the images were also always, you see the boats, with this unfortunate, big cargo, human cargo, hundreds of people, and they're in the middle of the sea, and there are the drones, and then all of a sudden, you basically don't know what happens. So we're very moved to go back to our country and try to understand, once the migrants arrive on our shores, what happens, what's the next chapter. And this was the very beginning of the film, the way it started.
And that was the beginnings, and you say, of this last wave that we're still seeing now. When did it start for you? When did you start shooting?
We came up with the idea of a document, which is our job. So how can we tackle this situation? How can we render it and reach out to as many people as possible? And so we thought, let's work on a documentary. And we started to travel to Lampedusa, and we went there and we started meeting people. We met the main players there, because we realized that the coverage of the news was black and white. So it was the migrants landing on the island, and then they were getting into the detention center, and then they would disappear. Nobody would know where they ended up. So instead, we decided to go there, and we started talking to the main players, who were the refugees on one side, and the volunteers and the humanitarian workers on the other hand. We met the attorneys who were helping the refugees, and we started researching, but it took a while to find our character, of course.
So fast forward, 2 or 3 years later, as we were thinking that, the crisis was around Lampedusa and going all the way in Northern Europe, the biggest crisis ever happens on the Balkan route. And this is when a social producer, Sara Bergamaschi, joined us, because she's going to tell us how it started. But a common friend who's working at the United Nations put us in touch, because Sara was working with them at the United Nations, and she actually had helped Wael's brother, Tahir, that we see here and there in the film, a few months later to before to go all the way to Germany.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Hi everyone. I met the family, the Syrian family in Syria 10 years ago when I lived in Syria. I became very close to Wael's brother Tair, and in the summer of 2015, Tair took a boat from Egypt to Italy, and then he went from Italy to Germany, and I accompanied him on the trip. So that was the first trip I took. And when he got to Berlin, he got political asylum. He told me, Sara, you remember I have 7 brothers and sisters, actually 8. And so one of them will try to make the same journey in the fall. If they made it to Europe, would you like and go walk with them and accompany them? And so I made the promise. And so the call came, the family got out of Syria, and I promised to go, so I was about to leave. And a few days before, 1 week before, I met Lorena and Filippo, and they were already filming this very comprehensive movie about migration, and I told them the story and what I was going to do. And obviously, this is something that needed to be on the screen. And so we started the production journey together, and from Turkey to Germany, and that's how it happened. And I'm very moved, and I think it's beautiful to see this after 3 years on the big screen and their story. And you know, we're all very happy to be here tonight.
You're Italian descent, correct? It was difficult to watch certain parts of this film, especially the ones who were protesting the immigration. I don't know how you felt about it as you were filming. If you can tell us how that felt for you. You are Italian. You were watching these other Italians protesting the very idea of immigration. As an American, it was difficult for me to watch because my parents came from Syria and from Turkey. We are of Armenian descent, and immigrants do help countries. I don't know how you felt about it. Just filming it, and it just, I don't know, for me it was just like, just don't know how you felt about it.
I hear what you say, and I think that, I mean, our job, we're documentary filmmakers, and so we're telling a story, and for us it's very important to tell stories that always, you know, make your audience connect with the story, and try to, in a way, portray multiple layers of this story. So to try to, in a way, bridge that gap that you're talking about. You know, so of course it's very polarized, but at the same time, when we were on location, we realized pretty soon that we could not only tell the story of the refugees, because this is a crisis. It's, of course, it's one of the biggest crises of the past 50 years. But it's not only the refugee crisis. This is a cultural crisis. This is an identity crisis. This is a political crisis. So our goal at the very beginning, and that's why it took a while before trying to understand, before understanding how to structure the film, because at the very beginning we thought, let's go to Lampedusa, it's a microcosm, and we're telling this story of what happens when the migrants arrive in Lampedusa and what's the next step. And then we went there, and you have the refugees, you have the fishermen, you know, usually arrive for 1 or 2 days and then they leave. And then you have all these, the crowd, you have the military, you have the humanitarian workers, you have the lawyers, and then you have the locals. So once you plunge yourself, you really, when it's when you make a film on such a complicated story, and there are so many out there, you do want to make a film that pauses. Instead of going, you know, as we keep seeing, of course, and then you go on the internet, you see the photographs and there are the headlines. The film usually should stay with you and should survive, you know, the news, so that it becomes a lesson, it bears witness, it raises awareness. So when you see those who were protesting, they were clearly against migrants. Our job is not to go and judge. Our job is to go there and ask questions. Why are you here? what your ideas, what you're thinking of, what are your problems, because it's the only way that you can make the next step. If we keep staying, and it's clear, our take, all of us, this is a synergy of people that we share the same values, and there's no doubt about, no walls. Walls is not the solution, but at the same time, dividing the world in two is not helping. So the answer, yes, you on one side you're very frustrated, but also on the other side, the real curiosity, that step that you wanna make to try to understand who's your opponent, and is he an opponent? Because oftentimes, even those that they seem evil, they're not. They don't have they when they see the family or a guy in real life, they are not. There is not that animosity. The animosity when you're far, right? When you're in Rome, when you're in Washington, it's like, oh, they're coming and they're doing this and they're doing that. Then for the real people who suffer, it's a psychological burden. And also the truth is that often migration happens and affect communities that are extremely poor, under-resourced, with very poor infrastructure, and so you have to understand sometimes the nature of the frustration. So in Lampedusa, people are extremely generous. They have had welcomed refugees for decades, and now they couldn't take it anymore because from Rome or from Brussels, they just leave the situation isolated because it's far, right? It doesn't impact elections very much because they thought it's Lampedusa and you have Malta and you had Lesbos. They were just these isolated situations, and all of a sudden they were not anymore because without a solution, without a real global migration policy, this is something that is here to stay. It's not going away, and there is no rally. There is no goodwill that can really change the situation.